the next item on the agenda is an informational briefing on offshore wind development in California. As you have heard in previous briefings and will hear again today, discussions around planning for offshore wind development have been active for more than 5 years amongst a coalition of state and federal agencies, tribes, NGOs, developers, academics, fishermen, and local communities. We are now in the precipice of moving from the planning stage to the leasing and project development stage. However, before we can make this transition, both the state and federal government have important regulatory decisions to make to ensure that future offshore wind development is sited responsibly in locations that are both feasible and protective of coastal resources. The Coastal Commission plays an important role in this process, and the purpose of today's briefing is to educate commissioners and the public on how the regulatory review process for offshore wind will work in preparation for those upcoming regulatory decisions. Before we jump in, I would like to note that today's briefing is centered around offshore wind development in federal waters. There have been smaller scale proposals for wind installations in state waters. In fact, the State Lands Commission is currently conducting a preliminary review of 2 proposals for wind turbines in state waters off of Vandenberg. However, it is likely that the vast majority of medium to large scale offshore wind development will be proposed in federal waters, and thus that is the focus of our briefing today. Next slide, please. Here is a brief agenda for today's briefing. We will start with presentations by state and federal agencies. First up will be California Energy Commissioner Karen Douglas, who will provide a high-level overview of how offshore wind fits into California's energy and climate goals. She will be followed by Jean Thurston Keller, a renewable energy specialist and California Offshore Wind Task Force coordinator with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who will describe the federal process for leasing and review of offshore wind projects. The last presentation will focus on the state's role in reviewing offshore wind development with a focus on the Commission's federal consistency review of potential lease areas, and will be provided by your energy, ocean resources, and federal consistency staff, including myself, Holly Wire, and Amanda Cusart. Agency presentations will be followed by public comment, and after that, there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments from the commissioners. So now I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Karen Douglas. And Billy, I believe Commissioner Douglas does not have a presentation or slides, so we can go back to the Hollywood Squares view. There we go. Commissioner Douglas.
All right. Thank you so much, Kate. And good morning, commissioners. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to speak to you on this really important topic for California. I'm the point person for California on the BOEM California Task Force, which has broad state and local and tribal participation from around the state, as well as federal agency participation. And I've been working with our interagency California team, as well as the BOEM of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on offshore wind since 2016. And in that time, as Kate mentioned, we've made a lot of progress in understanding how offshore wind could play a role in California, the value of the resource, potential areas where it may be appropriate, and some of the data and information that we're going and outreach that still needs to be done in order to really be able to fully assess projects when they're brought before us. As Kate mentioned, we've now reached the point where our work on offshore wind is transitioning from the more exploratory and preliminary stage to a point where California is going to be making decisions about lease areas and ultimately projects in conjunction with our federal partners. And as Kate mentioned, and as subsequent presentations will describe in more detail, the Coastal Commission has a very critical role to play in this. So I'm going to leave the details on offshore wind process and next steps to others. My presentation is really focused on some of the broader context and how this relates to California's climate and energy goals. So
Recording in progress.
In climate policy, we have very aggressive goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of our economy. That includes the electricity sector. where we are working to achieve a 60% renewables portfolio standard by 2030 and a 100% zero carbon goal by 2045. We're currently in the electricity sector meeting our targets. We're on a path to continue to achieve our targets, and our share of greenhouse gas reductions. But we're going to have to continue that, and we're going to have to continue that in light of ever more aggressive state goals and other parts of our economy, for example, transportation through electric vehicles, ports through electrification, some industrial users, where possible, transitioning fuel switching to electricity. So we're going to be seeing demand increase for building uses, from fuel switching, even as we are meeting more aggressive percentage reductions and moving towards zero carbon electricity system. To meet our long-term goals, we estimate that California could have to deploy renewable energy and storage at a rate of 4 to 6 gigawatts per year starting now and going on for decades. And so that just gives you a sense of context. I think the other context piece that I wanted to mention is that you may know that we are currently in an electricity emergency right now. There is an emergency proclamation that was issued by the governor for conditions this summer. And it's because we are experiencing a near-term climate-induced or climate-enhanced electricity emergency, where we are operating a system that just wasn't designed around the level of heat events, west-wide heat events that reduce the availability of electricity imports, reduces the heat events, reduce output from gas plants. We're dealing with wildfires that also reduce through smoke the output of photovoltaic panels, transmission impacts. So the fires directly impact transmission. The smoke can impact transmission, that can reduce imports into the state. Of course, the transmission lines have been found to have sparked major wildfires, and that has also had significant impacts into the electricity sector. In a normal year, we average 2 flex alerts per summer generally, and that's been the trend for quite a long time. This summer, including today, we are on our 8th, and we're not through the summer yet. So that's the other part of the context that I really wanted to bring to the Coastal Commission as part of this overall discussion. In terms of offshore wind, there are a number of reasons why it's a very appealing resource in light of our energy transition. It's got a very high capacity factor. That means that when you build a project, it's generating electricity much of the time, most of the time, in contrast with something like solar, which generates electricity when the sun is up and does not generate anything when the sun is down. Offshore wind has the potential to add significant resource diversity into our system. So the more dependent a system is on any one renewable resource, the more it has the risk of falling into a hole when something happens to impede that resource or when that resource is not available. So whether that's smoke reducing PV or the big issue we have right now is what we call our net peak hours. Those are the hours when the sun is going down. So the solar production is getting, less and less throughout the day, but demand is going up because people are going home and turning on their air conditioners and, plugging things in and turning things on. And so that net peak time, that evening time between 4 and 9 p.m. is very difficult for us in our system. And it just so happens that offshore wind is very productive during that net peak time. So it's a very good complement to solar. It's also very productive in the evening hours and really, as I said, high capacity factor much of the day. So It adds geographic diversity. A lot of our renewable energy imports into load centers, which are coastal in California, Southern California, and the Bay Area in particular, come from east of those regions, and whether that's because they're all the way from Nevada or Utah, or whether it's because more likely they're from the desert or the Central Valley, they're coming from east and going to the coast. Bringing in some resource from the west actually helps us reduce the need to import additional electricity over very constrained lines, and it could help us actually reduce the need to have coastal gas plants. That's something we're analyzing, but to the extent that you can bring renewable energy into these load centers from the west, you then have energy that you can use to charge batteries and to help run the system, which in the long term, through some energy planning that our state energy agencies are working on collaboratively, I think we're going to see that as an important benefit. On the Central Coast, there's the potential for offshore wind to plug into existing infrastructure. There are also some interesting ideas for undersea transmission that could play into that. On the North Coast, that area is very transmission constrained. Right now, all projects that are being discussed are really for local consumption, but it's one of the best wind resources in the world. So there is long-term potential there. There are a number of energy analyses going on right now. Some look at the system and how it can work as we transition to our zero carbon trajectory. Some are looking at transmission. I'd be happy to share more information about them now and as they go forward. The CPUC is currently assessing offshore wind in the integrated resource planning process, the independent system operators looking at transmission. So in the energy side too, this is becoming much more of a here and now conversation, understanding that it takes time to bring these resources forward. But we're looking at them in a very concrete way. So I say all of that by way of context, but just stepping back for a moment to the Energy Commission's role and to our interagency state team. It's our goal to work together to bring the best possible information to the state broadly and to work together to articulate and promote the state's interests and policies here. So we're looking hard at environmental information. We believe very strongly in the need to conduct outreach and to engage Californians in what this could look like and how this could play out in coastal communities if these resources are brought forward, and to have that level of discussion. We supported that with a joint budget request, which was fulfilled. And so we do have some resources that we're working together collaboratively to bring forward. And I'll just close by saying that the Coastal Commission has a very critical role in this. And so our interagency team is very committed to supporting the Coastal Commission and the staff in bringing forward the information that you all will need and want to see. So I appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion, and I'm going to stay and listen as well, and I'll be available for any questions or discussion at the right time. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Next, we'll have Jean Thurston Keller present, and she does go back to our staff presentation. Her slides are incorporated with ours. Next slide. Next slide. Great, thanks, Billy. Jean?
Great. Well, good morning. Bowen would like to thank the Commission for the opportunity to speak before you today, and to thank the Commission staff for their participation over the years in our planning process. We have worked closely with Commissioner Douglas and others on the task force to really identify areas that would be most suitable for offshore wind development. My name is Jean Thurston Keller, and I'm the BOEM California Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force Coordinator, and I'm the California Project Lead for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Pacific Regional Office. In addition to myself, Mr. Doug Boren and Ms. Lisa Galbane from our office will also be available afterwards today to answer any questions you may have. Next slide. Being mindful of the Commission's time, here are the key items we'll go over today. We'll start with a brief overview of offshore wind energy, as well as our joint collaborative planning efforts with the state of California, and look at some of the challenges of offshore wind energy planning. And then we'll focus on our process and where the Commission's work would interconnect with that, and potential areas we are initially looking at for future development. And then we'll have some next steps and sources for additional information for you. Next slide. So I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about the basics of the technology. Offshore wind farms are very similar in structure to land-based wind farms, but there are key differences, however. Offshore wind turbines are taller and larger than those found on land. Floating wind turbines also must be anchored to the seafloor with a mooring system and are electrically connected together with inter-array cables suspended in the water column to transport the energy to an offshore substation when required. This is required often for when amperage needs to be increased in order to send it to shore via export cables. These cables are often buried and meet land through horizontal directional drilling methods. Once on shore, the export cables would connect to an onshore substation and then deliver the electricity to the larger grid. Additional information about how an offshore wind farm works is available in a webinar link at the end of this presentation if you would like a more in-depth look. Next slide. So I really started with the technology because that's how we started our joint planning process. We began with the basics and started with technical constraints first to answer the question of where offshore wind could possibly go. So we began with the resource, looking at wind speeds that are greater than 7 meters per second based on recommendations from the National Renewable Energy Lab. Areas in gray on your screen are less than 7 meters per second, so not suitable. Then we looked at water depths. The experts at NREL again recommended roughly 1,100 meters for likely maximum depths. And so that's outlined in that dark blue line. And then we also avoided any national marine sanctuaries, which are shown in bright blue, where BOEM does not have leasing authority. This left us with about 6% of all of the waters offshore California could even technically support offshore wind development. This essentially bifurcates the state into two primary areas of focus for us: the north coast near Oregon and an area in the central coast between Cambria and Point Conception. We also considered where existing interconnection points to the grid were located. As Commissioner Douglas mentioned, Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant on the central coast is an obvious choice, along with the retired coal-fired power plant at Morro Bay. And on the north coast, there is an interconnection point at Eureka. So this is where we focused our efforts, closer to these interconnection points. Also, through conversations with the public and input from state agencies, we also did an initial screening to avoid areas closer to shore that tended to have higher concentrations of fishing activities. We also avoided areas with high concentration of submerged offshore cables and heavily used vessel traffic areas such as the Santa Barbara Channel. Next slide. This led us to really the challenging part of planning and siting potential offshore wind energy development. Through our outreach, we understand that there is not a single place offshore California that does not have some degree of use or conflict. So the key is balancing all these often conflicting uses and concerns. Next slide. So there's a lot of human uses of the ocean here in California. Next slide. Such as the fishing industry, the challenges of where the fishermen go. Next. There are also cargo vessels transiting offshore. Next. And the busiest port in the United States is located in Long Beach, California. There's also military operations. Next. Naval training activities. Next. And there are also non-human uses. Next, such as avian species who forage off of our coasts. Whales. Next. Marine mammal species. Next. and migratory paths and corridors for a multitude of species that utilize the rich resources of the California current. And further, there are unique concerns to California, such as landmarks of cultural significance, next, and views from the iconic California coastline, next, that we must consider in all of our decisions. Next. These are a lot of concerns, and BOEM has been mandated by law and by Congress to have the responsibility to tackle these issues and challenges as they apply to leasing in federal waters. But as mentioned before, we don't conduct this responsibility alone. There's several state and federal laws that would apply to any project that would be built and connected to the shoreline. So although BOEM is charged with the decision, it affects many other uses, other groups, agencies, and laws. And so we work with others to fulfill our responsibilities. Next slide, please. Because of these overlapping responsibilities, BOEM and the state of California established a task force in 2016 to look at offshore wind energy planning and the potential for development. The task force is a governmental forum that includes sovereign tribal nations, representatives of US federal government agencies, government of California, and locally elected representatives. Through early discussions in 2016 and 17, BOEM and the state developed a joint outreach plan and created a website to house data and information that we would collectively gather moving forward to inform our planning and siting process. In 2018, after many months of outreach, BOEM and the state identified 3 areas offshore California based on our initial screening and stakeholder outreach results. BOEM published these areas for official public comment in the Federal Register. We received over 100 comments and 14 nominations of interest from potential developers. BOEM and the state will continue to reach out to affected users and to local communities who may be affected by our decisions. This and more information is summarized in 2 editions of the California Offshore Wind Energy Planning Outreach Summary Report that's available at the link provided at the bottom of your screen. Next slide. So some of the key input that we heard, stakeholders identified several key issues, including fishing, environmental concerns, and potential visual and noise impacts from turbines. In response, we've begun more fishing-related studies and are working with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Pacific Fisheries Management Council to better understand fishing dynamics, including changes over time. Based in part on concerns expressed about navigational safety and shipping, the United States Coast Guard is conducting a Pacific port access route study to look at several emerging issues, not just because of offshore wind development, but there are several other issues. But they will be looking at vessel traffic and port access. So we are jointly working with them as it applies to offshore wind. Stakeholders expressed concerns about potential visual impacts, and BOEM worked with California State Parks and the Coastal Commission to develop visual simulations of what an imaginary offshore wind farm would look like from key points along the coast at different distances. Stakeholders also expressed interest in potential economic impacts and benefits and how BOEM would consider local community benefits in any future auction process. And so we'll be looking at that in the future. The Departments of Defense and Interior have been in long discussions about military testing and training activities offshore California and its potential compatibility with offshore wind development. So the key takeaway from this slide is we do listen and we do have an obligation to balance multiple and often conflicting needs and concerns. But there are no areas offshore that do not have some degree of conflict. Next slide, please. So here's a slide on the California Offshore Wind Energy Gateway. It's our data portal that we developed in conjunction with the California Energy Commission. It's here if you'd like more information on the different data sets we have. There are links to spatial data in addition to metadata, journal articles, and reports. As new data becomes available, we work with our partners to get these data into the gateway, and the website is available at the bottom of your screen. This data is very important and can feed into key environmental review points and decision points in BOEM's renewable energy authorization process. Next slide. So BOEM's process, it follows 4 basic phases starting at the top left: the planning and analysis phase, the leasing phase, the site assessment phase, and then finally construction and operations. We're currently in the first phase of the process in the planning and analysis phase, which began in 2016 with the establishment of the task force and public outreach and engagement efforts to identify potential areas for leasing. In 2018, BOEM identified those 3 areas offshore California for potential leasing, and we published these in the Federal Register in a notice known as the Call for Information and Nominations, which you can see with an arrow. It says BOEM initiates leasing process call. Following publication of the call, BOEM uses the comments received to identify the areas that appear to be the most suitable for future leasing through area identification. These areas that become known as wind energy areas would then be the focus of an in-depth environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. If, after NEPA review, areas for leasing are offered, we move to the next phase in our process, known as the leasing phase. The leasing phase consists of additional public notices, including both a proposed sale notice and a final sale notice. And this includes more opportunity for public comment. And this is where federal consistency, next slide, under the Coastal Zone Management Act would apply. We anticipate a lease auction will occur in fall of next year. A lease, however, does not allow for any construction to begin. A developer must conduct surveys before designing a project. So the third phase in the process is the site assessment phase, where developers have up to 5 years to conduct site characterization surveys to assess the lease areas in minute detail. These surveys would answer questions such as what is the tensile strength of the seabed in order to determine what types of anchoring systems the developer would use. What does the seabed look like? What are the locations of rocks or canyons that should be avoided? Surveys are also done to answer potential data gaps, such as where could there be uncharted shipwrecks or potential locations of deep water coral beds. A lessee needs to understand these detailed characteristics of the site first in order to answer questions of how to construct a project, the best size of the turbines to select, and places strong enough that could anchor a structure. So this phase would end when a developer submits a construction and operations plan to BOEM, which is the 4th phase of our process. A second NEPA environmental review would examine the results of any surveys and the proposed construction and operation plan designs of an actual specific project. Next slide. This is also where the second federal consistency review would take place before approval of any construction and operations plans. So we don't have specific parameters and designs for an actual project, like the height of the turbines, how many, and where they'd be anchored, until the review of a construction and operations plan the lessee would submit to BOEM for approval after the surveys are conducted. So again, there's 2 NEPA processes and 2 federal consistency reviews. First is for lease issuance and anticipated site characterization survey work, and then a second federal consistency review for the specific construction and operations plan designed based on the results of those surveys. Next slide. These are the 2 areas that BOEM is considering at this time for potential offshore wind development: the Humboldt wind energy area on the north coast and a central coast area that may include portions of the Morro Bay Call area originally published in 2018, with 2 additional areas known as the east and west extensions on the central coast. And I'll describe how we got to those extensions in just a moment. The key takeaway from this slide is that these areas will have separate environmental reviews. Next slide. So for the Central Coast, the Morro Bay and Diablo Canyon call areas seen here were published for public comment back in October of 2018. Next slide. There were challenges associated with these areas. Next slide. For the Department of Defense concerning national security, and through high-level discussions between the Departments of Defense, Department of Interior, and the state of California, additional areas for consideration were determined to be the focus for more discussions to see if a working group led by Congressman Carbajal could find compatibility between military activities and offshore wind energy. These discussions focused on the Morro Bay Call area only. It did not consider Diablo Canyon at this time. So we are not looking at Diablo Canyon now. Next slide. In alignment with the state's goals and support of the Biden administration's commitment to a target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, the White House announced an agreement to advance areas for offshore wind on the north and central coasts in May of this year, which includes an area of approximately 399 square miles offshore Morro Bay that appears to be compatible with military testing and training activities. This 399 square mile area includes 2 small areas, next slide, that were not within the original Morro Bay Call area and Federal Register notice. So these two areas are the subject of a new call for information nominations that is open for public comment until September 13th. Next slide. After public comments are considered, BOEM will undertake area identification for the Central Coast and may identify a wind energy area and begin an environmental review. Because the Humboldt Call area did not have any national security issues, BOEM is currently in scoping for an environmental assessment for the Humboldt wind energy area, which has already been identified. After completion of environmental reviews, BOEM will publish a proposed sale notice for both the North Coast and the Central Coast under one single all of California proposed sale notice. This proposed sale notice typically has a 60-day public comment period and is the last opportunity for developers to indicate their interest for an area. All public comments would then be reviewed and considered, and then BOEM would publish a final sale notice and conduct a lease auction where one or more leases would be awarded. Again, a lease does not allow for any construction activities to occur. BOEM anticipates holding the auction in fall of 2022. Next slide. So throughout all this process, BOEM funds and supports research to inform all of our decisions. Our studies are often driven by the results of our outreach, and several studies in recent years have been a direct result of input we have heard during our engagement efforts over the past few years. BOEM is partnering with several state agencies right now, and we're leveraging study funds and collaborating on ideas for studies. BOEM has partnerships with several California institutions, such as the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, or MBARI, Cal Poly, Humboldt State, several of the UCs, as well as state universities. Next slide. Here's a list of additional sources of information I promised you at the beginning of the presentation. I highly recommend bullet number 3, which is selected BOEM funded research informing renewable energy offshore California for the commissioners. Next slide. And then here are some more links to different things that we have available, including the visual simulations I talked about briefly. Next slide. So here's my contact information, and our team is available here today and anytime to help answer any of your questions. And thank you once again to the commissioners for the opportunity to come before you today. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Jean, very much. Back to Dr. Huckabridge.
Yes, thanks to Commissioner Douglas and Ms. Thurston Keller for their remarks this morning. And just so the public and commissioners are aware, we will post these slides on our website so that if you would like to go back and look at some of the links that were provided and just go back, it's a lot of information. We'll make that available on our website. So for the next slide, please. For the last part of the presentation portion of the briefing, we'd like to focus on the state's role in reviewing offshore wind development in federal waters offshore of California. And as I mentioned earlier, again, the focus for today is on process. We won't be getting into the substance of coastal resource issues or impacts today. That will come later. Next slide, please. The staff presentation will cover 5 main topics. First, we'll cover a very brief overview of federal consistency. We will then move on to the Commission's role in planning and permitting for offshore wind, followed by discussion of the scope of the federal consistency review prior to leasing, a description of some of the state's outreach and engagement efforts, and finally, ongoing and future research and data collection efforts. Next slide, please. The Commission's federal consistency authority is derived from the Coastal Zone Management Act, which many of you are familiar with, but I know we have a few new commissioners, so I want to make sure we go over some of this now. Passed by Congress in 1972, the CZMA provides for management of the nation's coastal resources through a federal and state partnership. Similar to the LCP provisions in the Coastal Act, the CZMA encourages states to develop a coastal management program, and once certified, describes a process for state review of federal projects or federally permitted or funded projects for consistency with the certified CMP. California's CMP was certified in 1977. The Chapter 3 policies of the Coastal Act serve as the enforceable policies of California's CMP. These are the policies against which all applicable actions are reviewed for consistency, and why the substance of a federal consistency review is largely the same as a CDP review. Next slide, please. The review process described in the CZMA is called the Federal Consistency Review Process. These reviews can be separated into two types. First, they're consistency determinations that apply to federal projects. Second, consistency certifications that apply to private projects that require federal permits or are federally funded. The test for whether a particular project is subject to federal consistency review is whether that project would result in spillover effects into the coastal zone. In regular permitting matters, the Commission's jurisdiction is determined by whether or not the project is located within the coastal zone. But for federal consistency matters, it is the effect of the project and not the location that determines jurisdiction. Next slide, please. With that introduction, we can now move on to talking about offshore wind. So this slide depicts the Commission's jurisdiction over various components of an offshore wind project, or at least to the extent that my crude PowerPoint skills will allow. In the center of the slide are the main components of an offshore wind project and their general locations in the onshore and offshore environment. This includes turbines in federal waters, power cables traversing through federal and state waters that connect to onshore transmission infrastructure. The Commission has a different type of jurisdiction over each of these project components. In federal waters, the Commission has authority to review under federal consistency. In state waters, the Commission has direct permitting authority. For shoreline and onshore development within the coastal zone, the specific location of the development will dictate whether the Commission reviews proposed development through a CDP, a port master plan amendment, or potentially an appeal of a CDP issued by a local government with a certified LCP. As with any major development project, there will be overlapping approvals required by a variety of other state, federal, and local jurisdictions. However, it is important to note that the Commission is the only state agency with a regulatory role in reviewing the project components in federal waters. Next slide, please. So let's zero in on the review process for potential offshore wind development in federal waters. If you'll recall Ms. Thurston Keller's presentation, there are two opportunities for state review of activities related to offshore wind in federal waters. The first will be a consistency determination to review the lease areas and process proposed by BOEM, which will occur prior to a lease sale. BOEM will submit this CD based on environmental analysis, or EA, it will prepare under NEPA for activities anticipated during leasing. The second opportunity will be a consistency certification for the construction and operation of a specific project. For these CCs, each individual project operator will be the applicant for those CCs. In discussions with BOEM and other state agencies and anticipation of a potential lease sale as early as next year, again, as you heard Ms. Thurston Keller mention, the Commission could see a CD for the North Coast wind energy area as early as March of next year, followed by a CD for the Central Coast in June. These dates could change, but are the current goals for review of leasing activities. So before I turn it over to environmental scientist Holly Wire to describe the scope of the review intended to inform this first consistency determination, I would like to point out that although the scope of BOEM's NEPA review prior to leasing is relatively narrow and focuses mostly on review of activities that could occur during leasing, such as buoy deployment and survey activities, Coastal Commission staff, along with our sister state agencies, believe that a broader review of potential impacts associated with offshore wind development within leasing areas is needed to inform a decision on whether BOEM's proposed leasing areas are sited in a manner that is consistent with the resource protection policies of the Coastal Act. To that end, our state agency coalition has been working independently and with BOEM to gather necessary data and information needed to inform this Commission's federal consistency review, which Ms. Kuzart will discuss in more detail. And with that, I'll go to the next slide and turn it over to Ms. Wire.
Thank you, Dr. Huckelbridge. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'd like to start by spending a few minutes describing the scope of the federal consistency review for these proposed lease areas. Overall, this is a siting level review and analysis of impacts to coastal resources from offshore wind development in those proposed lease areas. The review is going to make an overall assessment of the consistency of offshore wind development, the Coastal Act policies, and generally it will be seeking to address how the proposed lease areas were determined, what impacts we can anticipate from offshore wind development in these lease areas, are these the right areas to develop offshore wind in California, and what we can do to avoid or minimize impacts. Throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about mitigating, minimizing, or avoiding impacts. And I want to be clear that at this stage, mitigation is really about identifying strategies to avoid impacts rather than the traditional type of mitigation you would see for development projects. Next slide, please. More specifically, the consistency determination will assess consistency with coastal act policies relating to marine resources and water quality, commercial and recreational fishing, tribal and cultural resources, scenic and visual resources, public access and recreation, coastal hazards, and air quality. And for each of these policy areas, the consistency determination will make an overall assessment of the existing resources, identify potential impacts to these resources from generic offshore wind development, identify ways to eliminate or minimize impacts, as well as possible mitigation strategies, assess consistency with the enforceable policies of the Coastal Act, and identify data gaps as well as expectations for information needed when we start doing project level analysis. I'm going to take a moment to go into more detail on a few of the Coastal Act policy areas, including marine resources and water quality, scenic and visual resources, tribal and cultural resources, and commercial and recreational fishing. Next slide, please. The marine resources and water quality analysis will include an analysis of impacts to benthic habitat and aquatic vegetation, including deep sea corals, which we've heard about through a number of presentations today, marine species, including pelagic and benthic fish, marine mammals, sea turtles, and birds. We'll also be looking at water quality, including potential impacts to upwelling. On a side note, offshore wind is considered a fill of coastal waters under the Coastal Act, and so the consistency determination will include an analysis of the proposed action and a discussion of alternatives. Next slide, please. For scenic and visual resources, views are really a critical component to public access and enjoyment of the coast. To conduct our scenic and visual impacts analysis, we will be identifying and focusing on visually sensitive areas within the viewshed of the proposed offshore wind lease areas. We'll be using visual simulations developed by BOEM to understand the visual effects of offshore wind, including both daytime and nighttime views. And we will consider how leased areas and turbines can be sited to minimize impacts. Next slide, please. We anticipate that offshore wind leasing and development will also impact tribal cultural resources, and we will be engaging in formal tribal consultation to focus our analysis through identifying cultural resources and uses of the coast, understanding impacts to those resources and uses, and understanding how to avoid or minimize impacts through siting. Overall, our tribal and cultural resources analysis will really be driven by that consultation process. Next slide, please. So finally, both commercial and recreational fishing are expected to be impacted by offshore wind development. In the federal consistency analysis, we plan to identify impacts by fishery to the extent feasible, rather than looking at fisheries aggregated together. And we're going to be considering both exclusion from the areas within the turbines, as well as potentially longer transit times to and from fishing grounds. We'll also be discussing high-level indirect impacts to the broader seafood industry, such as wholesalers and processors. Part of this analysis will also include a consideration of the cumulative impacts of ocean species conflicts on fisheries. This includes both offshore wind build-out and other uses such as aquaculture. One final thing I'd like to mention is that at this stage, we will be performing an initial broader or programmatic impacts analysis to fisheries, and then we'll be developing a process to inform future consistency analysis and mitigation when we actually have turbines going in the water. We intend to inform our analysis and mitigation strategy through conducting outreach and engagement with the fishing community. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Coussart, who will go into more detail on our outreach and engagement plans.
Thank you, Holly. Next slide, please. So building off of Holly's last slide, I wanted to highlight that coalition of state agencies that we've mentioned a couple times today. And that coalition has been collaborating to help us orchestrate additional studies that are informing our CD analysis, conduct outreach, and help to clearly define our state's energy goals. This collaboration has helped to unify the state's review, collect data from a lot of different sources, and we're very glad to have representatives from the Energy Commission, State Lands Commission, Utilities Commission, Fish and Wildlife, and Ocean Protection Council with us on the call today. Next slide, please. The coalition's focus, therefore much of the analysis that we'll be doing is complemented by outreach and engagement, which has been going on for about the past 5 years. So along with our state and federal partners, we consider this to be one of the most critical elements of our process. And as part of this process, we do outreach to several different components of the community. First is tribal outreach. On the North and Central Coast, we do our outreach with state and federally recognized tribes. Dr. Huckabridge, our Coastal Commission Tribal Liaison, has received several consultation requests from tribes on the North Coast thus far that she will be managing in the coming months. And we also plan to conduct outreach and consultations with tribes on the Central Coast as that process continues to unfold. Regarding fishing activities, we are participating in statewide fisheries engagement with commercial, charter, and recreational fishermen. And in this respect, we are collaborating with our state and federal partners to do CD-specific outreach again in the coming months before we have our first hearing. With respect to local communities, we consider those to be anyone that may be impacted both positively or negatively, members of the public, groups that were not previously identified, such as ENGOs. We encourage that outreach to happen, and we continue to conduct that again as this process goes on. And finally, we conduct a lot of our general public outreach through a variety of different formats. And that's webinars such as this one, informational hearings. We conduct previously in-person meetings, phone calls, emails, and informal webinars. All of these can be formal or informal in nature. We encourage members of the public to reach out to us or to our partner agencies as they are able. Next slide, please. And so as previously mentioned, I wanted to highlight some of the examples of studies that the State Coalition has helped to produce and some that are in the process of being developed. These studies can be broadly categorized into a couple different areas. First is environmental studies, which are listed, and those do include fishing, data integration, technology studies, and a few others. Next slide. They've been designed by the State Coalition to complement BOEM studies and to fill the knowledge gaps that are helping to inform our consistency analysis. While the studies to date have been mostly focused on the North Coast, since it's the first area under review, we anticipate that many more will come about as we continue to work on offshore wind development, and the State Coalition that we work with to help develop those studies will continue to evolve and support those needs. And you'll notice the little asterisk that indicates future studies that are still in the process of being developed. Next slide. At this time, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Huckabridge for her closing remarks.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks to Holly. I also would like to again thank Commissioner Douglas and Ms. Thurston Keller for their remarks today. And I'd like to give a special shout out to our state agency staff partners, many of whom are on the Zoom today. Preparing for these CDs is a heavy lift, and I'm grateful for all the support from our state coalition, especially from our sister resource agencies, the Energy Commission, Ocean Protection Council, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and State Lands Commission. And with that, that concludes our presentation, and I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huckabridge. I think at this point we'll bring in speakers, and then we will take comments and questions from members of the commission. And let's allot them 3 minutes apiece, and I'll turn it over to the facilitator.
Great. As a quick reminder, I will announce the names of the upcoming speakers and bring you in as a panelist when it is your turn. As we bring you in, your Zoom will reload. Please remain muted until it is your turn to speak. First up, we have Douglas Boren, followed by Jennifer Lucchesi, followed by Eli Harland. Mr. Boren, I believe you are already in as a panelist. You may unmute yourself, start your video if you would like, and state your name for the record.
Great, thanks. I wasn't really expecting to go now, but I am Doug Bourne. I'm the regional supervisor for the Office of Strategic Resources in the BOEM Pacific region. You know, I won't take anyone's time, but I did want to say thanks to Dr. Huckabridge and Commissioner Douglas for the great words earlier. And, you know, thanks to Jean for giving the presentation, but really I'm on for if there's any questions that come up where we can provide a little more information later on in the conversation. But thanks again to the commission, and I'll hopefully be talking to you again soon.
Thank you. Next up is Jennifer Lucchesi. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Good morning, Chair Padilla, Commissioners, Executive Director Ainsworth, and staff. My name is Jennifer Lucchesi. I'm the Executive Officer for the State Lands Commission. The State Lands Commission manages tide and submerged lands off the coast of California from the mean high tide line to the 3-mile state federal offshore boundary. We are responsible for issuing leases for any transmission infrastructure relating to offshore wind that will be located on ungranted state lands that connects any offshore wind development to the shore. Meeting California's climate equity and economic goals requires focused and collaborative action to quickly transform the state's energy system away from carbon-based fuels. The state agency coalition that you've heard about already has a strong history of working in close partnership to implement this transition, including renewable energy facility siting and planning in the California desert through the DRECP, and the decommissioning of offshore oil and gas operations, including Rincon Island and Platform Holly, the last oil platform in state waters in the Santa Barbara Channel. Today's informational hearing represents an opportunity to further enforce and empower the entire state agency coalition working on offshore wind planning and permitting to continue its strong collaborative work. Such collaboration is critical to ensure responsible science and data-driven planning and decision-making for offshore wind on behalf of the entire state, while respecting and leveraging the unique expertise, resources, jurisdictions, and authorities of the various agencies involved. Our teams are working extremely well together. While you're hearing from agency leaders today, we all have an interdisciplinary team of dedicated professional scientists, engineers, and analysts working together to analyze and understand the existing data and identify the data gaps. They've also been pooling resources, leveraging staff expertise, and closely coordinating all along the way. For a state known for its numerous agencies with overlapping interests and jurisdictions, this state agency coalition is a model for future collaborative work where furthering shared statewide interests are paramount. As Dr. Huckelbridge, mentioned, the State Lands Commission is currently processing 2 separate applications for floating offshore wind turbine projects for state waters offshore Vandenberg Air Force Base. The State Lands Commission's first discretionary decision relating to these applications is whether to develop an EIR for the proposed projects, the next necessary phase in application review. To help facilitate public engagement and inform the Commission's decision, staff has prepared a draft preliminary environmental assessment. Our 60-day review and comment period ends on September 13th. It is important to note that these 2 applications are completely separate from the BOEM process for offshore wind proposals in federal waters. In conclusion, we all have a role in advancing a clean energy future. Responsible management of the state's public trust in coastal resources, which is often achieved through a shared vision with meaningful partnerships and robust collaboration, is designed to support this critical transition. The state agency coalition understands that it is critical to promote and practice transparency in data collection and analysis to understand the current state of the ocean and coastal space. Put all the facts on the table so that everyone is aware of potential benefits and trade-offs so that our decisions reflect the state's values and priorities. Thank you for the opportunity to address the Commission today, and we look forward to the work ahead.
Thank you. Next is Eli Harland, followed by Christopher Potter, followed by Jonna Gagnon. Eli Harland, I'm not able to find you, so if you could please raise your hand by pressing the button in Zoom or dialing *9 if you're on the phone, we can find you that way. In the meantime, we will begin with Christopher Potter, who is now in as a panelist. You may unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Padilla and Commissioners. I'm Christopher Potter, a Senior Environmental Scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Marine Region. Over the last 5 years, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, or CDFW, has been involved in offshore wind outreach and planning, primarily through the auspices of the BOEM California Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force. Specifically, CDFW staff worked with task force members on outreach, planning, data analysis, agency coordination, and environmental review. CDFW has responsible for offshore wind energy project review and permitting under a number of roles. As a trustee agency for fish and wildlife resources, CDFW holds those resources in trust for all people of the state and has jurisdiction over the conservation, protection, and management of fish, wildlife, native plants, and habitats necessary for biologically sustainable populations. CDFW jointly manages federally managed fisheries through the Pacific Fisheries Management Council that was established pursuant to the federal Magnuson-Stevens Act. The focus of my comments today, though, will be on the impacts offshore wind will have on fisheries and natural resources. The spatial data for marine fisheries varies from really good to poor. While we have a good understanding of where fishers operate and to some extent the scale of catch in any given region, there's still more to be done to fill in data gaps. CDFW is working with partners to help ensure a complete picture of the economic value of our fisheries is available to inform planning and policy decisions. CDFW also wants to ensure that as the process moves forward, California's fishing communities are well represented in the planning and design stages. This means frequent communication with industry leaders, regular updates to the rest of the industry, and a clear understanding of the trade-offs between offshore wind and access to historical fishing grounds. CDFW is working to develop an outreach strategy that leverages our existing relationships with the fishing community. We're also looking forward to working with your staff to help ensure the environmental review is thorough and that impacts to this important California industry are avoided or minimized to the maximum extent possible. Finally, offshore wind energy development will require major redevelopment and expansion of a number of California ports, for example, Humboldt Bay and Long Beach. CDFW staff will work with Coastal Commission staff and other agencies to advance planning on environmental impact assessment and associated mitigation measures and to prepare for permitting of port redevelopment projects. Thank you for this opportunity to provide comments today. I look forward to further collaboration with the Coastal Commission.
Thank you. Next is Jana Gagnon, followed by Janet Eidsness, followed by Darren Gertler. Jana Gagnon, I believe you are in as a panelist. You may begin.
Great. I just want to do a quick sound check.
Yes, we can hear you.
Terrific. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. Chair Padilla, Vice Chair Brownsey, Commissioners Dr. Huckelbridge, and team. My name is Jana Gagnon. I'm the Sustainability and Government Affairs Director for the Blue Lake Rancheria Tribe, a federally recognized tribal nation within Humboldt County on the North Coast. The tribe also serves on the BOEM, California Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force. I really want to thank you for this presentation. And we know that the Commission, the California Energy Commission, and BOEM and others are all working very diligently on this topic. And we know that as we do this careful consideration of this new Pacific Coast industry, we can utilize the information that we can gather from commonplace offshore wind farms internationally, and we can downscale and provide new data and research as we go into these new Pacific Coast environmental conditions. So I just will want to limit my comments to a couple of updates. The North Coast is launching a community benefits convening strategy. And what we aim to do there is to help the region define what kinds of impacts, mitigations, solutions, and investments local constituencies would like to see included in enforceable environmental permitting and leasing documents. This community benefits effort also may include formal community benefits agreements or sets of agreements directly between parties and developers, but that's for a different conversation. We want to say that over the last 5 years, offshore wind development on the North Coast has been socialized from time to time, and that this region has demonstrated an eagerness to engage. The industry and opportunity is potentially large, up to several gigawatts of power, with equally large economic opportunity, climate change benefits, and a mix of impacts and improvements. We support active and meaningful engagement with tribal governments, county and other local governments, community-based organizations, environmental groups, BIPOC and disadvantaged community voices that have been historically underrepresented in these kinds of energy resource developments. And we urge all the agencies that are listening to consider strategic financial and technical resources for community engagement downscaled into these regions that are exploring offshore wind. Those kinds of things would be very welcome. And in that way, we can meet the California Coastal Commission and other agencies in the middle with active community engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, we have Janet Eidsness, followed by Darren Gertler, followed by Delia Bensi-Kang. Janet Eidsness, it is now your turn to speak. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Hello, I'm not sure. Oh, maybe you'll have me. Good morning. My name is Janet Eidsness, and I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Blue Lake Rancheria. That is an appointed, not an elected position with the tribe. And I work with Jana Gagnon as a colleague. So I just think it's really important to acknowledge that the Humboldt Call area is directly offshore and within the Wiyot ancestral area. There are 3 Wiyot area tribes, or 3 tribes federally recognized that have citizens of Wiyot ancestry, and they include Blue Lake Rancheria, the Wiyot tribe, and the Bear River Band of the Ronerville Rancheria. All 3 tribes do have tribal historic preservation officers, TIPOs. But I must say that after, with COVID and the fact that our programs have been in place for more than a decade, we have really are stretched at the limits of our capacity. But we recognize this is really important to be consulting with the coalition of state agencies involved for the onshore and the nearshore cultural resource impacts. Again, within many of them, which are likely to fall within the within the Wiyot ancestral area. So, I think it's going to be important for some assistance to the tribes to engage in consultation in the manner of funding, and also in sharing of a cultural resources database. I noticed in Ms. Coussart's presentation, there was a mention that possible cultural resource studies would be done in the quote future. Well, the time is now to have these discussions with tribes. It will be important for the agencies and the tribes to be sharing in the same database, and then tribes have their own confidential information that they might be willing to share in this process. Another observation in the presentation was that fisheries are kind of relegated to those white guy fishermen, the non-Indian fishermen, the commercial and recreational fishermen. But fishing, salmon in particular, is such a central importance to the Wiyot people, as well as other really important big tribes of the north coast of California, the Yurok, the Hupa, the Tolowa, and so on. So I think it's kind of a funny thing to not include tribes when you're having conversations about impacts on the fishery. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Darren Gertler. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, thanks for having me, y'all. My name is Darren Gertler. I'm an elected official with the Santa Cruz Harbor. I'm an elected port commissioner. Also happen to be a father, a teacher, an avid recreational fisherman, and a member of the Santa Cruz Commercial Fishing Association. I was hoping to spend some of my 3 minutes today talking about my concerns of the impacts and the amount of outreach that this offshore energy plan can bring, especially on the boating and fishing sector. For a long, long time, people have viewed the ocean as an inexhaustible resource. We can take whatever we want, we can put whatever we want, we can use it to cool this, we can use it to heat that. However, with just a little bit of hindsight and a little bit of awareness, I think we've all seen that some of the best laid plans have worked out pretty poorly. San Onofre Power Plant, pretty poor example of using the ocean to help produce energy. Morro Bay, Diablo Canyon, even Moss Landing in my own backyard. So what concerns me the most is that our oceans and our access, which is supposed to be unfettered, last time I checked, is going to be restricted. And it's going to be restricted to the highest bidder. And as we've seen many times before, even in my short little life, PG&E has had a really hard time not blowing things up, not setting things on fire. And I'm not sure, I haven't seen any assurance or have any reason to believe that if and when we start selling portions of the ocean, whether it be federal or state, I understand federal gives us a little bit of more space, but once things become federally legal, it helps create a pathway to become legal in statewide waters too. So I just, I've appreciated the presentation so far this morning, the facts and the info. However, I personally know that every time people say, oh, we're doing outreach with stakeholder groups, I know what those look like. I know how that works. I've been sitting behind a computer for 2 hours waiting for my chance to speak that I reserved 4 days ago. This isn't a proper way of getting the pulse of the public or the outreach or the stakeholders. Fisherman outreach has been failing for over 100 years statewide. And I'm worried that people are waving this big green flag and talking about greenwashing, but the impacts on our coastline are going to be detrimental. The impacts on Sacramento or Santa Cruz Harbor, where I'm an elected port commissioner, will be detrimental if it's no longer truly a port of safe haven and a port that supports commercial fishermen. If access to the harbor going in and out is restricted, there will be serious, serious issues that we all saw coming, and it's been recorded live on the internet. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Next is Delia Benzie-King, followed by Hillary Hauser, followed by Ken Bates. Delia Benzie-King, it is now your turn. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Good morning, Commissioners. Delia Benz-King, Northern and Central California Regional Coordinator for the Surfrider Foundation. Thank you for the presentation and the opportunity to speak this morning. As many have said, California has an opportunity and responsibility to become a visionary leader in offshore wind energy and create a planning process that sets a high environmental standard for this new technology and ocean use. We understand that developing renewable energy is pivotal for California to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, achieve a zero carbon energy future, and maintain our thriving economy, healthy communities, and a national role as an environmental leader. However, offshore wind development will also have negative impacts on our ocean and coast, and we must carefully consider the siting and design in order to avoid and mitigate the impacts. We are glad to hear the Coastal Commission staff will be closely reviewing the proposed sale notice for federal consistency. Surfrider has long advocated for policies and actions to bring offshore wind projects to scale in an environmentally protective manner. One important consideration for responsible development for offshore wind energy includes avoiding impacts on marine and coastal habitats and the wildlife that rely on them. The coast of California is home to 124 MPAs and 4 national marine sanctuaries, and the effectiveness of the MPA network relies not only on the protections of individual MPAs, but on the connectivity of the entire MPA network. As a state, California boasts both the highest number of species total and the highest number of species that occur nowhere else. Our land and our coastal waters are a global biodiversity hotspot that must be protected. We also strongly support the following priorities for considering new projects, which are avoiding conflicts with other ocean uses, robust consultation with Native American tribes and communities, meaningful engagement with state and local governments and stakeholders from the outset, avoiding impacts to the environmental justice communities, and using the best available science and technological data. So we look forward to working with the Commission to ensure careful and responsible offshore wind development. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Hillary Hauser. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Hello. Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear and see you.
Good, thank you. Good morning, Chair Padilla and Commissioners. I'm Hillary Hauser of Heal the Ocean, Santa Barbara, and we focus on eliminating sources of ocean pollution, like septic systems and wastewater and so forth. We also worked really hard for the passage of SB 44 and worked with the State Lands Commission to cap the leaking oil well off Summerlin on the Santa Barbara South Coast. So I appreciate these presentations today from BEM and others, and would like to say that Heal the Ocean we're involved in commenting on the environmental review for the removal of the oil platforms from the federal water, and wonder why we're not really looking at them as platforms to install offshore energy production, including wind and wave. There's space out there that we don't have on land, and it's being explored elsewhere in the world. Even green hydrogen that can be piped to shore. There is already infrastructure to get the energy to shore. And so it could, due to the deep water in the federal zone, these platforms would be anchored to the seabed. Wind farms have to be anchored, high-powered one to the seabed. So why would we remove infrastructure that's already anchored to the seabed? The environmental review would necessarily have to examine the responsibility of oil companies for maintenance of the platform. We suspect there are ways to make this happen, but with the goal of reaching 100% clean energy by 2045, we think the infrastructure already in the ocean should be considered. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Ken Bates, followed by Gary George, followed by Claudia Harmon Worthen. Ken Bates, it is now your turn. You may unmute yourself and begin.
Good morning, commissioners. Good morning, staff, federal staff. My name is Ken Bates. I'm Vice President of Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association. Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association is a commercial fishermen's association incorporated in 1955 to represent Northern California fishermen in our area. Fishermen are not opposed to clean energy. Fishermen are concerned about the continuing loss of community fishing grounds. HFMA has been engaged in wind power negotiations with companies up here since 2018. Our association is leading a peer-reviewed fishing grounds mapping project accompanying the ocean from Point Arena to the Oregon border. Concurrently, 12 California fishermen's associations have spent the past 5 months trying to negotiate with an international submarine cable representative starting to install cables across the Humboldt County fishing grounds. We have learned a very valuable lesson here. At present, there is no state policy, no state plan, and no state guidelines for the minimization and mitigation of the negative impacts to coastal fishermen by non-fishing industrial developments on California's community fishing grounds. Again, looking at at what we see in the federal guidelines, we don't see federal policies to protect coastal fishing communities from these impacts. More than any other group, fishermen will be hit with all the negative impacts from offshore wind power developments. California's commercial fishermen's associations need a voting seat at the table before there's a lease sale, before there's a project, before there's a permits. The alternative is to damage California's 170-year-old sustainable seafood resource and the coastal communities harvesting this resource, essentially for what will eventually start out as an experimental attempt to feed America's insatiable appetite for more and more electricity and energy consumption. Please give California Fishermen's Associations a serious seat at the table so we can collectively figure this out to the best of our collective abilities. Thank you for the time today to comment.
Thank you. Next up is Gary George. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you, Commission. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. My name is Gary George. I'm Director of the Clean Energy Initiative of the Climate Strategy at National Audubon Society, and I'm here today representing Audubon and Audubon, California. Audubon's climate report at climate.audubon.org reveals that 389 species of North American birds are threatened with possible extinction by the loss of habitat if we can't keep warming below 3 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. The closer we can keep warming to 1.5 degrees, the better for birds. That is why we support net zero emissions, 60% by 2030 in California, 100% by 2045 in California, SB 100, and also California's long leadership in climate solutions. We support the consideration of the offshore wind in the outer continental shelf waters of California, and we've been working on this since 2016. That development of the offshore wind in the outer continental shelf water needs to be environmentally responsible in siting and operation that avoids, minimizes, monitors, and mitigates effectively for the impacts on marine wildlife, including birds. These animals are already stressed by ocean infrastructure, fishing, vessel traffic, and climate change impacts, including acidification. So our seabirds, our coastal birds, our shore birds, our water birds, and our trans-Pacific migrating land birds, these are all protected by federal and state laws. Most importantly, the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the parallel California laws and regulations recently revised by AB 454. We remind the Commission to value considerations of birds and these laws that protect these birds in the consistency determinations under the Coastal Zone Management Act. And Audubon looks forward to working with the Commission on these determinations. I also want to thank Dr. Huckabridge for her animated birds in her PowerPoint. Those were very cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Claudia Harmon-Worthen, followed by Kate Kelly, followed by Tyler Tretton. Claudia, it is now your turn to speak. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Hello. Yeah, this is Claudia Harmon-Worthen. I had a conversation with Mr. Romero, BOM, and he told me that the cables that will be coming from the offshore wind turbines will actually be going all the way to Long Beach. He said they would not be going into Morro Bay. That's just a point of information. It makes them 250 miles of Ethernet charged cables going all the way to Long Beach or wherever they end up. So which will transmit under the sand and the floor bottom. Anyway, because of all the conversations, I'm going to try to change around what I had to say. One thing I'd like you to all remember when you're looking at this project is to think about maybe the time possibly when you saw a moon set. There's nothing more spectacular. The lights will be on the horizon and forever change that. In the past 4 years, our nonprofit, I'm president of Beautify Cambria, has hosted seminars, stargazing events, educational events, and outreach. We actually have one scheduled for October 9th. We are deeply committed to become the International Dark Sky Community, codified by the International Dark Sky Association. And we're supported by our county supervisor, the advisory council, our services district, local groups, and other Central Coast towns are on board to follow our lead. Red, white turbine lights on the horizon will possibly thwart our effort to become certified, and certainly forever mar our dark ocean with awe-inspiring moon sets, meteors, and the Milky Way. Only 20% of the world can see this awesome cluster of constellations, and the numbers are decreased each year by about 3% from more and more light pollution. The Central Coast dark sky must be protected. In my research, the turbines must be installed at least 35 miles offshore to avoid most of the negative impacts. At 800 feet tall, this distance needs to be greater. Fog is a big issue. It needs to be studied. The wind machines will change the heat and the cool of that. That is what keeps our endangered Monterey pines alive, and so that's very important to our community. Oxygen, you probably already looked at this one, has to do with what's happening with the seaweed that's already been killed off in Northern California. The lubricants that are being used, I'm sure you'll look at those things too. Mostly, I think I want to talk to you about the lights, because to have our coastline forever ruined by those lights is going to be devastating. And I live near the ocean, and we have many, many tourists that come to our community. And we have the Hearst Castle, who look at that night, they have night tours. And those people can look at that majestic ocean and the moonset and going to see a bunch of lights. So it's devastating. Thank you very much. I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. Next is Kate Kelly. It looks like you're on the phone, so I will allow you to talk now. You may need to unmute yourself on your end by dialing *6. Kate Kelly, if you're there, please unmute yourself.
Good morning. This is Kate Kelly. Sound check, please.
Yes, we can hear you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Good morning, Chair, Commissioners, and staff. Thank you for your time today. I'm Kate Kelly, and I'm speaking on behalf of Defenders of Wildlife. Defenders of Wildlife has long advocated for policies and actions to bring offshore wind projects to scale in an environmentally protective manner. We understand that developing renewable energy is pivotal for California to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, achieve a zero carbon energy future, and maintain our thriving economy, healthy communities, and a national role as an environmental leader. Careful consideration of how we achieve this zero carbon future is vital for protecting California's internationally treasured wildlife, landscapes, marine ecosystems, cultural resources, and diverse habitats. We recommend deferring the final identification of wind energy areas and leasing and permitting until an analysis identifying least conflict areas can be completed. The California Energy Commission, as part of its work in implementing SB 100, has developed a methodology for identifying least conflict areas that are appropriate for renewable energy development and transmission investments. While this work is currently focused on terrestrial renewable energy development, their methodology, in conjunction with the data from the California Offshore Wind Gateway, can be rapidly applied to state and federal waters. Identification of least conflict areas for offshore wind development can increase project viability, certainty, and potentially allow for an expedited process in permitting offshore wind projects in the future. Given the importance of protecting California's natural capital, which drives the state's ocean economy, Defenders would like to work with you to ensure leasing and siting decisions reflect California's unwavering commitment to protecting the maritime environment. Implementing a deliberative planning process that prioritizes environmental protection and considers stakeholder interests will demonstrate this environmental leadership that will benefit this industry while protecting California's natural resources. We thank the Commission and their staff for the efforts on a consistent review, and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Next, we will have Tyler Tratton, followed by Kristen Hislop, followed by Adam Stern, and followed by Lisa Belenke. Tyler Tratton, you are now in as a panelist. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Padilla, commissioners, and staff. Tyler Tratton on behalf of American Clean Power California. The American Clean Power Association enables the transformation of the U.S. power grid to a low-cost, reliable, and renewable power system. ACP California is a state project of the National Trade Association with a particular focus on California's clean energy policies. We are grateful for the opportunity to provide comment in support of offshore wind development off California's coasts for the suite of economic, environmental, and energy benefits that offshore wind can provide to Californians. We encourage partnership and collaboration among the agencies, particularly between the Coastal Commission and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in this phase to ensure environmentally responsible and timely development and deployment of offshore wind at scale. We look forward to working with you and the other engaged parties as we move toward offshore wind leasing in federal waters off California's coasts. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Kristen Hislop. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you. Kristen Hislop, the Marine Conservation Program Director at the Environmental Defense Center. We are a public interest environmental law firm that serves San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties. Thank you so much for your great presentations today. We really appreciate all the work that BOEM and CEC have done to advance responsible energy to reach California's energy goals while also considering ocean users, the environment, cultural heritage, including indigenous sacred sites. So EDC is supportive of renewable energy that will allow us to transition from fossil fuels and have been working to advance responsible offshore wind energy that is sited, constructed, and operated to avoid and minimize impacts to the marine environment. EDC and other ENGOs have been focused on the importance of siting and planning to ensure that offshore wind has the least environmental impacts as possible while providing the opportunity for California to transition from fossil fuels. As the speakers noted, the California coast is highly used for commercial and recreational purposes and has areas of impressive marine biodiversity. And maintaining the integrity of these overlapping uses and marine resources is vital to California's coastal economy. We hope to see a least conflict siting process, as Kate Kelly just laid out, in the future and identify the best areas for offshore wind in California instead of continuing to respond to industry lease requests as our main siting mechanism. We believe this will benefit the environment and advance the offshore wind industry more rapid pace. We understand that agencies are already working together, and we very much appreciate the outreach you all have done to date. We hope you can increase your capacity for a more robust planning process with legislative and budget support. We also are focused on while we are focused on federal waters today, we also have proposals for wind projects in state waters. The State Lands Commission is currently accepting comments on 2 projects in Santa Barbara County in a problematic location seabird and marine mammal abundance that are adjacent to the Vandenberg State Marine Reserve and are within the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, which both fail to avoid sensitive environmental resources. We would much prefer to spend our time working on projects in areas identified through a least conflict planning process and avoid impacts to the most unique of California's marine resources. After all, environmental organizations support offshore wind so we can protect the environment on a global scale by affecting climate change. With that, we also need to protect biodiversity and coastal dependent uses on a local scale. Finally, we hope that BOEM requires an EIS at the leasing stage as opposed to an EA, which would provide for a stronger consistency review by the Coastal Commission and the public. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Adam Stern, it is now your turn to speak. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you, commissioners. Sound check here. Can you see me?
Yes.
Terrific. I'm Adam Stern, Executive Director of Offshore Wind California, a business association of offshore wind developers and technology companies. I'd like to commend all of the state and federal officials for your thorough and thoughtful presentations today. We look forward to working with you to ensure that this important resource is responsibly developed off the California coast. I also want to thank members of the Coastal Commission, staff, and participating public for the chance to speak briefly about offshore wind power and the opportunity it presents to help power California's clean energy future. Bipartisan support for offshore wind continues to grow from state lawmakers and voters. For Californians, supporting clean energy means making choices on what kinds of power generation will provide the most benefits, have the fewest negative impacts, and work together to supply reliable, pollution-free electricity night and day. In a recent SB 100 report, the state's energy agencies concluded that California will need a large, diverse, renewable energy portfolio, including at least 10 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity to achieve its 100% clean energy goals by 2045. 10 gigawatts of power, the peak output of offshore wind farms in the proposed portfolio, represents almost 15% of the state's current electricity needs during late afternoon and evening hours when electricity use is high and solar generation is fading. Building 10 gigawatts of offshore wind power capacity would create tens of thousands of good-paying union jobs, save ratepayers up to $2 billion for installed clean power capacity, generate billions for the state's economy, and enable our state to cost-effectively meet its 100% clean energy goals. Based on experience with projects in Europe and a growing number of projects on the East Coast of the United States, we're confident that we can develop offshore wind in a way that's environmentally responsible, protects our coastal and marine resources, and coexists with other ocean users. We're committed to working with the Coastal Commission and other state and federal agencies to complete review of the federal government's proposal to lease wind energy areas off Morro Bay and Humboldt Bay, and for the site assessment work and formulation of development proposals. This will be followed by a comprehensive review of specific project proposals. It's important to recognize the clear and present climate dangers that we face. The recent spate of wildfires and heat waves in California and extreme weather elsewhere in the United States underscores that we're facing a climate emergency. Not sometime in the future, but now. Offshore wind is an important part of the solution, and we need to move forward with its planning and deployment. Our nation's clean energy and climate future depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Lisa Belenky. Please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. My name is Lisa Belenky. Good morning, commissioners. I'm with the Center for Biological Diversity. I want to talk a little bit just about climate change and our shifting energy sources. The center is very dedicated to moving away from fossil fuels, but we can't do that in a willy-nilly fashion that just drives us to more impacts that will also affect other resources and potentially climate as well. We need to do this in a smart way, and we need to do it with planning. So I want to definitely support what both Kristen Hillsop and Kate Kelly discussed, which is the need for a least conflict planning effort along the California coast and not being driven to the places that were already identified by BOEM. We're quite concerned with the statements by BOEM that imply that there's conflicts everywhere. So we just, have to do it where we think there's the least conflict without doing the analysis. The fact is that there are conflicts everywhere, but some will be more problematic for species and other resources than others. And we really need to do that research before these projects are approved. And we know that the agencies will be doing that in the future. We want to make sure they're done early enough that it really can lead to avoidance of the worst impacts and a real robust look at alternatives, including other types of alternatives for energy production, like distributed energy, energy conservation and efficiency, which cannot be forgotten in this process. They're extremely important, and just rushing to a new energy source isn't the only solution for our current situation. California coast, as has been said many times, is very rich in biodiversity and cultural resources, and we need to protect those. I just, again, want to emphasize the need for data collection and depth of data that can really show how different species and others, including fishing, et cetera, use the ocean specifically, not just generally, so that we know what the potential impacts will be, direct impacts and indirect impacts, such as avoidance of areas. And we really need to know what are going to be these impacts and whether there is any potential mitigation. So I just want to caution that we need to move forward and shift our energy from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but offshore wind is only one type, and it should be done in a way that balances climate responses with potential additional impacts. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. That concludes our public comment, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for all the speakers' participation and agency reps. Dr. Huckelbridge, any final comment?
No, I think I'll just be here with our staff, and a bunch of the other agency staff are also available to answer any questions and listen to comments from commissioners.
Thank you very much. I'll bring it to the commission. I'm going to go first to Commissioner Gold.
Thank you, Chair Padilla. A bunch of things. Just wearing, I guess I have too many hats today because not only being on the commission, but as the executive director of the Ocean Protection Council and the deputy secretary for Coast and Ocean Policy, just involved in this issue in many, many different ways. A couple of things I want to bring up that I think have largely been brought up by by the speakers so far. I've been incredibly impressed by the speakers from the public as well as from the agencies and the information that's been provided today. I think everybody understands that we are in an unparalleled climate crisis, and we all need to do our part to do something about that. I think it all started with Commissioner Douglas in talking about, just briefly, I know Karen, she could have gone on for 2 hours easily on everything that CEC is doing in energy efficiency and really transforming the state of California in many different ways on energy efficiency and moving us to renewable energy in a major way. But she only had a few minutes. And so I just bring that up because at least we didn't hear a lot of testimony saying that there's not an understanding of how big this climate crisis is, and that people are open to really look at offshore wind as a potential part of a very complex solution in really managing this crisis. Another thing you heard was collaboration. And I have to tell you, I haven't been working here that long, a little over 2 years as an appointee, but to have these weekly meetings for the last 4 or 5 months with Fish and Wildlife, with State Lands Commission, with the Coastal Commission, and with the Energy Commission has been extraordinary in that everybody has really worked well together, has coordinated. We understand how difficult these decisions are going to be and how monumental this is for the history of California and energy. This is not something anyone's taking lightly. So you have the highest level of directors, et cetera, that have been taking part in these meetings on at least a weekly basis. I haven't seen that for any other issue since I've been here. And so I just bring that to your attention to impress upon you how important it is. I also saw that the state responded quickly in putting money for this in the budget. And so the fact that there wasn't adequate staff at the Coastal Commission, there wasn't adequate staff at Fish and Wildlife. So funding came about to make sure that we have the people to deal with the complexity of these issues. And I thought that was very critical. We also saw that there were numerous data gaps, many of which have been discussed earlier today. I don't need to go over all of them again, but you might have to suffer through a little of it. And in that end, we got $2.1 million, which us at the Ocean Protection Council, we're working with all these various different agencies to figure out what can we do to fill these data gaps in an incredibly limited window of time. You saw the presentation, very comprehensive from BOEM. You saw that timeline. Although people have been working on this for 5 years, I think that's a little bit misleading. I would say the work pace prior to the inauguration versus post-inauguration has changed by over an order of magnitude. So it has really been a tremendous change. I can tell you personally, it's probably taking about 20% of my time working on this issue, and I'm not even close to being one of the leads on this, but I just think it lets you know how important it is to the administration. Within the Ocean Protection Council strategic plan to protect California's coast and ocean, we have objective 4.4, target 4.4.1. I'm just going to read it briefly, which is to work towards the development of a commercial scale offshore wind in California that minimizes impacts on marine biodiversity and habitat, currents and upwelling, fishing, cultural resources, navigation, aesthetic and visual resources, as well as military operations. I think you've heard that crystal clear from everybody who has spoken today. So nobody is talking about let's move forward with wind without protecting these areas, whether it's the least conflict alternative or whatever. I'm not sure what the right term is, but I can tell you from the Ocean Protection Council's perspective, protecting California's ocean resources, protecting important cultural and tribal resources, protecting the state's fisheries could not be more important to us. And so this is definitely a very difficult challenge that we're all working on together. To that end, luckily, and I think you heard from two of our former staff members today, I might add, Holly Wire, as well as Chris Potter, who are now at Coastal Commission and Fish and Wildlife respectively. And with Chris at the OPC, he had the foresight, working with many of the people you've heard about before, to fund a number of offshore wind research projects. And I'm not going to get into the details. I think Dr. Huckelbridge's staff briefly went over some of them. But what we're doing is using some of that $2.1 million to expedite the completion of those studies, as well as to add a certain study or two to fill gaps. We're even putting money towards expediting a study that BOEM was the lead on in regards to fisheries, because we're making it clear that Coastal Commission needs the most information possible to put together their consistency determination. And so that's really what our goal is when we're meeting together weekly and getting updates on the progress on those studies and what additional data gaps we have, is what can we invest in to get done as quickly as humanly possible to do so. So that's gathering all the data and doing the analyses on that data, which you can't imagine how extensive it is, and really putting like 2-page summaries together for Coastal Commission staff, so it'll be much easier for them to put together their consistency determination, rather than staff having to do specific analyses on all the data on their own. So it's really been an incredible collaborative team effort. We think it's going to work well, but I think we're all breaking ground here in what we're doing, because we understand it's really never been done like this before, and especially for something this important for California. I can tell you personally, and I think my colleagues at OPC would agree, we're saying let's go forward with offshore wind, but do it in a way that's basically going to set the environmental standard for the rest of the world. And that's the goal that I can tell you I personally have, and how we're moving forward in environmental protection and involving the fishing community and involving the tribal community, multiple, every step of the way moving forward. And so I had a lot more that was written. I haven't stuck to Pollyanna of it at this point, but I think I've largely touched upon what I think are the most critical points of where we are. I will tell you one thing, because I think we heard from the fishing community, a couple people today. The work that's being done up in Humboldt is being fishing community led, on letting us know where they're fishing and where the most important resources are to them. We're trying to, break the sound barrier here and do the same sort of thing on the Central Coast, working with the fishing communities there. We understand it's difficult. We understand it's a punctuated time period, but we can't imagine doing consistency determination without really hearing directly from the fishing community on what's most important to them. The first stage in the consistency determination, as you heard from Dr. Huckelbridge, is really looking at a lot of these things in the big picture on the lease area. Sort of a way to think about it is almost like a programmatic EIR for the ocean on offshore wind. Where you really get into the details is obviously going to be on the individual projects and the consistency certifications and the CDPs and those sorts of issues. But we want to make sure that all the bases are covered for the consistency determination. I can tell you on behalf of OPC and all the other different agencies that we're really doing everything we can to support your staff to make sure that this is as comprehensive as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come to Commissioner Hart.
Thank you, Chair Padilla. I didn't hear you. I wanted to express my gratitude to Dr. Huckelbridge and to all of the speakers, including to you, Commissioner Gold. I thought that was very important. And I have to say that I very much look forward to engaging on this issue. It's so critically important. I just wanted to make a brief comment, and it's something that is very easy to forget. When you're thinking about climate change, and here we are, we're looking at a potential very significant technology to address climate change, which is offshore wind. I think that it's sort of similar in a lot of ways to when we think about solar. And when I was on the State Parks Commission, for example, we had a big project which was a proposal to put in wires through Anza Borrego through a wilderness area in order to bring significant solar energy to the San Diego area. And that's when this topic that I want to express really came up, which is when you're thinking about climate change and mitigation and reduction of emissions, it's always critically important never to forget the impacts of climate change. What we're trying to do is address the impacts. And what is one of the most serious impacts of climate change? It's impacts on biodiversity. And so those things always have to move forward together. And that's why I think that this approach that is embracing what are the impacts going to be on avian species, on fish species, as well as all of the other impacts, but is to always never forget, never get so involved in the mitigation that you forget why you're doing it. You know, what is the underlying problem that you're trying to address? So I think that from my perspective, I am always going to be thinking in that way. I believe my fellow commissioners will always be thinking in that way as well as we move forward with this process.
Thank you, Commissioner Hart. I would agree. Vice Chair Brownsey.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to associate myself with the comments of Commissioner Hart, well spoken with respect to the impacts on and the need for biodiversity to be concurrent with any of the decisions of the solutions to climate change. First, I want to really thank the staff. This was an excellent presentation, and I really want to thank the leadership of our staff as well as Karen Douglas at the Energy Commission and Commissioner Gold at OPC and Jennifer Lucchese and Mr. Potter over at Fish and Wildlife and Jennifer, of course, at State Lands and BOEM, because the thing that I thought was really good about this presentation was its comprehensiveness. And I think that when these issues come before us, it will be, this has been so helpful to understand this comprehensive process that has occurred and the coordinated and the coordination and the collaboration of our sister agencies on these projects, because I think that's going to accelerate the problem solving when the inevitable challenges present themselves. And I just really want to say how much I appreciate that and do hope it becomes a model for the rest of the world. I just want to make just a couple comments. One is I was struck by the statement from one of the public members with respect to resources for those local communities. And the reason is that in our experience as coastal commissioners, often on these big projects, these controversial projects, we hear from members of the local community who felt like they weren't involved in some way and that these they didn't really understand the procedures. And so I hope we can, in this collaboration with our sister agencies, look at each other's best outreach efforts to engage at a local level, and maybe some resources would be helpful in terms of public outreach and public education. So I thought that that was a really pertinent comment, and so I hope that will be considered as, and so just to finally state, I just want to really commend everybody. This is an excellent effort, and I hope that this is carried forward through this process and that we do get to the point where we can start to address our energy needs without the use of carbon and without the use of fossil fuels. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Gold?
Thank you, Chair Padilla. Just in quick response to the comment from Vice Chair Brownsy. There probably wasn't enough time today to really go over the extensive outreach program that's going on right now. And it's, it's something that I'm sure Dr. Huckelbridge can get into in more detail. I know Fish and Wildlife's leading the effort in the fishing community. I had the pleasure of going with Commissioner Douglas and Commissioner Huckelbridge and others to do outreach to multiple tribes on the West Coast, as well as to the Harbor District and some members of the fishing community. So those efforts are ongoing, but related to that, which I think is just probably a lot more important in the big picture in the long term, is everybody who we're meeting with is talking about community benefits and really understanding what those community benefits are, not just the impacts, but what can be done to really enhance community benefits. And that's really, directly related to what you're talking about. And those discussions are starting now, but they're going to continue long before anyone starts constructing any project. That's for darn sure. But that really, that sort of outreach is occurring now. Community benefits discussions also will probably be initiated in earnest a lot more, my guess, and this is, I defer to Dr. Huckelbridge on this, post the consistency determination at the beginning in June of next year.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Escalante?
Thank you so much, Chair Padilla. A lot to take today. I took quite a bit of notes. I've been kind of holding myself, in a block in my eyes pattern so that I could come to this meeting and take everything anew and from scratch about kind of how California is going to approach this new future that we are envisioning for ourselves, to be able to fulfill the goals of getting 100% clean energy and to electrify and switch from all of our fossil fuels. So I echo Commissioner Gold's initial comments about, how really grateful I am to be able to be at this juncture where we are deliberating about how to make something like this happen, as opposed to how to enable fossil fuels to continue, functioning in our California coast. So I do agree with the stakeholders that obviously this needs to be done in a very responsible manner with the best science. And obviously the, COP is coming and the world is definitely watching. And so is the federal administration. So, this is a tall order of business for us to navigate. So I do really appreciate all the collaborative efforts among agencies. I am also very sensitive now that I'm getting to know the North Coast a lot more, is the need for more wildfire-proof, local, reliable, clean energy. So I like that about this. I appreciate Commissioner Gold's comments about the emphasis on community benefits. Local jobs, training, especially with intentional focus on uplifting the most disadvantaged communities, trying to also uplift the tribes in the region as well. I think that's going to be essential for any of this to succeed. I do have a couple of questions. Something that did stick to my mind was the fact that the Blue Lake Rancheria representative mentioned that fishing for Native Americans was not specifically recognized in the presentation. And I do think that is important, especially when we're talking about the North Coast. If we can, it's not just commercial or recreational fishing, or as it was mentioned as white man's fishing, but it's also, substance fishing for a lot of communities here, and cultural fishing. So I think that would be important to clarify and include. One thing that I also was interesting to me was this comment from the person from Santa Barbara talking about replacing existing oil platforms. I don't think that I don't know actually. I don't think in the North Coast there are, but please educate me, staff or Commissioner Gold, or somebody can just address that comment by the public. And I'll just have a couple more questions and then I'll let it go. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Escalante. I can respond to some of your comments. I guess I can start with the comment on the oil platforms. There are no oil platforms up in the North Coast. And I think that it's not inconceivable that those platforms could, in an alternatives analysis, could be repurposed for some other use, including alternative energy. I think part of the issue, if you'll remember back to the wind energy map that BOEM showed in their presentation, the wind speeds down in the channel aren't great. Plus those platforms are much closer to shore. And so the concern would be that impacts to sensitive species, birds, could be greater that close to shore. But again, there's the process going on in California that's looking at decommissioning a lot of those oil platforms. And I think that repurposing them for a number of things will be on the table and something that will be analyzed. But again, I think if you're looking at it at a very large scale, the amount of power that could be provided at those platforms is probably on a much smaller scale than what could be achieved either up at the North Coast or off the Central Coast as described today. And then I also wanted to respond a little bit to your comments and the comments from the Blue Lake Rancheria. I completely agree. And it is critically important that we understand the cultural and tribal uses of the ocean, as well as resources. And we are in the process of beginning our tribal consultations. I was able to go up to the North Coast and meet with many tribal representatives for the first time a few weeks ago, and I'm looking forward to continuing those conversations. What I took away from those comments is that we do need to be reaching out to tribes to understand if there are members or if the tribal representatives would like to be involved in the outreach and discussions we're having with the commercial fishing fleet, with the recreational fishers, because I agree that is a critically important use that needs to be understood and addressed in this engagement process. So I will definitely be doing that as well. And then the last, just to make one comment about the community benefits portion, this is, as Commissioner Gold mentioned, something we've heard a lot from local communities that we've visited with, that this is a critically important thing. I think for the purposes, in terms of timing, and I would agree with Commissioner Gold that I think those types of agreements will really get into high gear after leasing occurs. However, I think our goal for the CD hearings is to describe at least those elements of those agreements that are related to Coastal Act issues. Not all of them are, and so won't really come under the purview of the CD, but if there is a nexus with Coastal Act issues, we want to be sort of, again, identifying those like potential impacts and potential strategies for addressing those impacts in a future, whether it's a community benefits agreement, it could take the form of conditions as part of a lease or conditions in a future, whether it's a consistency certification or a kind of a COP permit, a construction operations permit from BOEM. So there's kind of a lot of vehicles through which those community benefits can be addressed, and we're still trying to figure out how that's all going to fit together. I anticipate we'll have some progress by the CD and can give a little bit more of a sense of where things are, and again, hopefully address specifically the issues that have that Coastal Act nexus.
Through the chair, if I might just respond to Dr. Huckabridge. Thank you so much for all of that super thoughtful responses. And I think when we come to the juncture of the CD, I hope that we can have kind of a very thorough environmental justice analysis but to look at this community benefits lens through. So maybe that would help us kind of be able to dig in a little bit more and be assured that there's a shared vision between those who are going to develop this and those in what we want. So I do appreciate that. And the last thing on the tribes is that the request about resources. I think that is we should definitely take that into account. And I mean I understand that the feds also are very interested in this. So I hope that we can work on that. One last question. One of the commenters, I think it was Defenders of Wildlife, they asked to defer identifying the areas until analysis of least conflict. So can you just respond to that, Dr. Huckabridge, please? I would appreciate it. And thanks again, everybody and all the stakeholders and everyone for all the great discussion.
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely address that. And as Commissioner Gold mentioned, I think that's kind of where we're trying to get before the CD. I think BOEM and the state agencies involved in the task force did a lot of work to this point in looking at available data to determine potential areas for offshore wind. And so there's a lot of areas on the coast, as you saw in one of the maps that BOEM showed, that they're just not feasible. Either you don't get enough, the wind speeds aren't high enough, or it's too deep, or there's no interconnection possibilities. And so most of the coast is not, it's just not feasible to do wind power at a large scale. And so I think what BOEM and again, all these state agencies have been trying to work toward is then taking those other areas. And BOEM did do an analysis to come up with the specific wind, lease or wind energy areas that will eventually lead to proposed lease areas, which will come before you next year. And there was some kind of initial environmental analysis to look at species and other types of impacts. And what we're trying to do is add to that and make it a very robust analysis. So it will be, and we will be considering, for example, areas outside of the proposed lease areas. I think BOEM has done a pretty good job of narrowing the possibilities based on the data we have, but we're not going to be necessarily limited within a specific proposed lease area if we find, for example, some potential coastal resource impact that could be alleviated or eliminated by moving the lease area in a different section within that wind energy area. So that's the kind of things we're going to be trying to look at. It is a least conflict analysis in a sense. I mean, there's different ways to define what that is. And so, but that is exactly what we're trying to achieve, is answering the question, where are the best places to place this type of offshore wind development in a way that provides, the benefits to California that it needs, but also protects our, invaluable California ocean and coastal resources. So we are trying to get there. As Commissioner Gold mentioned, it's a lot. There's a lot of information, a lot of things to do. We are, basically running at breakneck speed, trying to get all this done, but within a timeline that makes sense, so that we can bring you that information next year, so you have that as you're making your decisions about whether to move forward on the consistency determination.
Commissioner Wilson.
Thank you, Chair Padilla. Well, first, of course, thanks to everybody, staff and presenters today. This is a pretty big issue in my area, as one might imagine. First, I want to align myself with a comment that Commissioner Hart mentioned, which is, as we evaluate impacts of these projects like this, it's in the context that nothing is status quo climate wise, right? We're moving in a trajectory now. We're just not, so doing nothing is not doing nothing. Doing nothing is moving us in a direction that we need to take very, very seriously from a climate perspective, and it impacts all of the things that we're worried about impacting, right? So doing nothing is an impact in and of itself. So we have to understand that. It's hard for humans to actually grok that, to be to be frank. It's very hard. And so I want to make sure that we're really thinking about that in all of our decisions, and especially something as big as this. I want to also mention that this community is unique in a lot of ways. Relative to this sort of thing, it's not just we have the local decision-making bodies as which on the Board of Supervisors, but we also have our local CCE, our Community Choice Aggregator, Redwood Coast Energy Authority. I'm also a member of that body. That is extremely that agency, our agency is extremely involved in these processes, especially with relationship to the potential purchase and use of the energy associated with this. So there's those are involved in that. We have Humboldt State University, which is moving towards Polytech status, which also part of that, and the reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, is because of the Schatz Energy Laboratory, which has many decades or some decades of research into renewable energies. This is extremely important, and what I'm framing for everybody is the understanding that this is an engaged community, and I want to acknowledge strongly the Commercial Fishermen's Association, as well as just fishermen in general, recreational as well, also very involved. And then the tribal organizations are really engaging and doing a lot of effort in this. And I want to acknowledge quite frankly, the growth and renaissance within those organizations that is starting to really gear up into this space. So this is really churning for us. This isn't, and like Commissioner Gold mentioned, this for myself, I have hats, and it's taking a lot of time and effort. And what I'm trying to culminate into is that we're looking at new technology. We're looking at new processes, really the most robust processes. That's our goal. That's what we want to have happen in this space. And then when we get into the community benefits, I really want to emphasize the goal is, in terms of community benefits, is to maximize that, whatever that is, in whatever way we can. And I think we're going to see a standard, I hope, if, again, this all assumes that something happens out of this process. I don't assume that necessarily, but I want to make sure that as a decision maker for my community, that whatever we move through this process it is the most robust process and has the best benefits for this community. And I think I want to thank everybody, because I really believe that commitment is there on all levels, on the stakeholders so far that have been engaged, as well as the agencies. And I'm gonna hold everybody to it as much as I can. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you, Dr. Huckelbridge. Thanks to everyone who participated. It's more than helpful.